I want to tailor this a little bit to the audience here. So is anybody here an attorney? Does anyone practice law? One. Okay. Two. Okay. So it looks like the two of you are a little bit outnumbered in terms of the rest of the group. So I am going
We'll be there.
All right, I'm going to start from the ground up then and go over some basics that you already know, or hopefully already know. So the Wisconsin's court system is basically a three-tiered system. You have your circuit courts, your appellate court, and your state supreme court. The circuit courts hear, basically all of the cases that, proper jurisdiction in Wisconsin. The sort of criminal, civil, family, everything. The Court of Appeals is an error-correcting court. So that is the court that is going to review the circuit court decision. So if there is a criminal trial or a civil trial or some other issue, that you have an automatic right to review before the Court of Appeals. Then you have the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the court that basically reviews some cases, and I apologize, I had the flu this week, so I'm not quite as sharp as I wish I was, so I'm going to refer to my notes sometimes. But the Supreme Court is a law-making court, and so it's not an error-correcting court. So for instance, if there's an issue at a criminal trial about whether the evidence is sufficient, but there's no question of law there that's at issue. That case is not going to go to the Supreme Court. If there was an error at the first level, the appellate court is going to decide that, and that's generally going to be the end of it. If, on the other hand, there is a really important issue of law, Wisconsin law, or I suppose federal law if it involves parties in Wisconsin, that is the case that the court will consider taking. The Supreme Court, I think it's about 1,000 petitions, and I have the facts here, but they accept very few. And they have to be cases that they believe will develop the law. So that's just sort of the basis. So you're looking at then, well, what is the composition of the Wisconsin Supreme Court? There are 7 justices, and you need basically a majority decision to have holding here that governs law. So you want 4 justices on one side of the decision. Okay. The makeup right now of the court is composed of Chief Justice Shirley Abramson. She's our most senior justice. She's also the Chief Justice because she is the most senior. Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, who is running for re-election. Justice Patrick Crooks, Justice David Prosser, Justice Patience Rogansack, and Justice Annette Ziegler, and Justice Michael Gableman. The composition of the court has changed some in recent years, and I think that Mike will talk a little bit about the elections. What I'm here to talk about is what we would look for in a justice. And I have some specific examples and some specific cases that I think might help sort of inform, why almost every decision that goes before the court is important, not just the ones that we hear about in the news. Maybe some decisions that are a little bit quieter, but actually have very far-reaching impact. And then I have some examples of why you want to consider not necessarily what a candidate's ideological standpoint is or what their political standpoint is, but what they believe about the law and what they believe about certain things that we call precedent, which is prior law, and what they believe the role of the judiciary is as a check and balance with respect to government. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit further, which is kind of wanted to give a basic sense of what the courts are. So, does anyone have any questions before I turn it over to Mike for his introductory remarks?
Yeah, you said that they decide whether or not they want to take the case.
Yes.
What, more specifically, is it the Chief Justice who decides, or is it the majority rule that decides?
You have there's a vote, yep, and so you need 3 justices to accept a petition for review, except there's a certain circumstance where you need to have 4. So, but generally you just need 3. The Chief Justice's role, which we can get into more, because I heard that Tim wants to talk a little bit about the referendum, because that's that issue. The Chief Justice's role has a lot to do with actually the administrative powers of the court. And so, because the Supreme Court also sets rules, and it administers the whole judiciary. And so, the Chief Justice has a lot to do with that. Okay? And I think seniority comes into play there, because it certainly makes sense to have a Chief Justice who has a lot of experience with the court, understands what the court's function is, understands what its administrative role is in terms of actually administering the entire judiciary.
Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I'm Mike McCabe. I used to be the director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, ran that group for 15 years, and of course specialized in tracking the money in state politics and working for reforms of campaign finance laws, as well as other laws relating to the health of our democracy. I left that role as the head of the Democracy Campaign at the end of 2014. I wrote this book, very hopefully and optimistically titled Blue Jeans in High Places, The Coming Makeover of American Politics, and touch on the courts as well as other aspects of our current political situation in the book. One of the things I point out is that we had a Supreme Court in the state that was one of the most respected high courts you would find anywhere in the nation. Wisconsin's Supreme Court was really considered a model for the country, and was a court that was frequently looked to by other state courts, and courts around the country would take cues from Wisconsin's Supreme Court. And that's not just an anecdotal assessment, but actually I cite a study in the book that was done by the University of California at Davis. The UC Davis Law Review looked at 60 years worth of decisions by state Supreme Courts nationwide. And what they found was from 1940 to 2005, the Wisconsin Supreme Court's rulings were adopted or relied upon by courts in other states no fewer than 660 times, making it one of the most influential courts in the nation, one of the most frequently cited, one of the most precedent-setting high courts in the nation. That was what our Wisconsin Supreme Court was. And of course, that has dramatically changed. And I'd like to just read a paragraph from chapter 14 of the book that addresses the current state of our Supreme Court. Imagine calling a female coworker a bitch and threatening to destroy her, and then calling another coworker a snake, viper to be exact, and finally finding yourself in a physical altercation with a third that ended with your hands on her throat. You would most likely, as an attorney specializing in employment law put it, not last the day. A Wisconsin Supreme Court justice did all of those things and remained on the bench. In many respects, our Supreme Court now has become something of a national laughingstock. And I think there's a powerful reason why. We've been electing Supreme Court justices in Wisconsin for over a century and a half. And for more than 150 years, that system produced a court that was nationally renowned, that was highly respected, not only here in Wisconsin, but across the entire country. And then starting in 2007, we saw those elections turned into auctions. And that has dramatically changed both the relationships on the court, the way the court is seen by the public, by the media, by attorneys, and by people in the legal profession. In 2007, we had a high court race, and total spending in that race was $5.8 million. That was more than 4 times more than any Supreme Court election had cost up to that point. Not 4% more, 4 times more than any Supreme Court election in Wisconsin history. The next election in 2008 cost $6 million and broke the record set in 2007. And so a new standard has been set. And that's what I mean when I say that our Supreme Court elections have been turned into auctions. And that's fundamentally changed a couple of things about the way we end up with people on the Supreme Court. One of the big changes is what candidates for the High Court have to do to be competitive and have a chance of winning an election. I tracked money for 15 years in state politics, and for most of that time, I can tell you that if you looked at the campaign finance reports of candidates for the Supreme Court, they looked dramatically different than the campaign finance reports of a candidate for governor or for legislature. Most of the people giving contributions to a candidate for Supreme Court were lawyers. The financial support came almost exclusively from the legal community. Today, if you look at the campaign finance report of a candidate for Supreme Court, it's if you blacked out the names and blacked out the office, you would have a very hard time determining whether that was a campaign finance report for a candidate for governor or legislature or Supreme Court. The sources of money that the candidates are receiving are almost indistinguishable. It's not support simply coming from the legal community anymore, but from wealthy special interest groups that have a vested interest in cases before the court and who very much want to shape the composition of the court to better their chances of prevailing in court. The major interest groups that bankroll legislative campaigns and campaigns for offices like governor, big business interests like Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, the realtors, the road builders, they're all in there donating organized labor when they had the capacity to be really big campaign donors, and that capacity's been reduced. But when they still had great capacity, they were right in the thick of things, helping to bankroll these recent campaigns for Supreme Court. That has politicized the state's High Court, and it has partisanized the state High Court. That court used to be seen as a more of a neutral body, more of an objective and impartial body. It's now seen as a highly partisan Supreme Court. Now, the other thing that really has changed about the way people are seeking public office, this particular public office, is the way they advertise, the way they campaign. One of the fascinating things, and you touched on the fact that the Supreme Court is not a trial court, it's an appellate court. It also is a court that deals primarily with civil matters, not too many criminal cases. And yet, when you look at the advertising for Supreme Court candidates, the advertising would clearly make the average viewer believe that it is a trial court that is deciding whether somebody is guilty of committing a crime or not, and a particular kind of crime, a violent crime, and then is also responsible for sentencing the person convicted of committing that violent crime. And it's ad after ad after ad that is pounding on this issue of public safety and about whether that judge will be tough on crime, implying that they're actually responsible for conducting criminal trials and then sentencing those convicted of those crimes. So the advertising is also warping the public's perception of what the Supreme Court even does. It's not a trial court, it's an appellate court. It deals with an awful lot of civil cases, some criminal cases, but an awful lot of civil matters, and yet that's not reflected at all in the campaign advertising that is being fed to voters. So that's left us, I think, with less public awareness of the true role and nature of the court. It's also left us with an environment that's far more partisan and far more political than the environment we had for 150 years. I'm going to touch later on what we might do about this, what some of our options are for dealing with this condition that we now have, and it's a recent phenomenon. Before 2007, we didn't have Supreme Court elections that remotely resemble the kinds of elections that we have today, and I really do think that we've moved from having Supreme Court elections to having Supreme Court auctions. So let me stop there for a moment. I'll dive deeper into how we might get out of this mess. But if you wanted to
Sure. And this is actually...
add anything, and I guess we can toss it over for questions.
Okay, that sounds good. This is sort of a nice segue to actually talking about some civil cases that the court has heard that I just thought might be interesting or might be particularly relevant to this election. So I chose one case in particular because it's a case that I worked on, and I actually worked on this case just at the circuit court level. But what came to light in this case in particular was how bad it is when the Supreme Court confuses the law. And how are the ways that that can happen, and how does that affect everybody? So this was actually an accounting malpractice case. And we represented a group of financial institutions, credit unions, who had brought a claim against accountants who we alleged, had missed a very dramatic fraud that had taken place. The people who committed the fraud are currently indicted in federal court and being prosecuted, but this was simply a negligence claim against the accountants, that they caused this direct injury to the credit unions. Well, one really just basic, important aspect of Wisconsin law is whether or not an injury to a corporation, because the credit unions had invested in a corporation, not as shareholders, but as investors, could be considered a direct injury or a derivative injury. And I won't get into the details of it except to say that there's just a very, very standard way that you look at this. There was very well-established case law. So I'm looking at this claim and I'm thinking, oh yes, our clients have a very strong case here to bring a direct claim, and if they can prove that the accountants were negligent and that they missed this, very, very dramatic fraud, they should be able to recover. Well, if a credit union is able to recover, where does that money go? It goes right back to the community, it goes right back to its members, and it goes right back to everybody who has, and who is a member of a credit union, because that they're part of the cooperative movement. So any chance for this case to succeed would benefit Wisconsin consumers. So I look at the case law, which is long-standing, and there's this case called Notes, which sets forth the analysis, and I think, yep, we definitely satisfy that. And then I get to this case, which I read a number of times. It's called Crier, and it says basically, oh, if a fraud occurs, it's never direct action. End of story. And it's very, very, very confusing. And it basically seems to say that the law is something different than what it has been for many years. And then there is this dissent, which Justice Bradley wrote, which basically says that. And she has been criticized recently for writing dissents. And her opponent has said that she should not be doing this and that it is disrespectful and that it is bad. And so I want to point out what he's really saying is when she's trying to clarify the law, maybe she shouldn't be doing that. So she writes this really wonderful dissent and just basically says the majority, which is the justices on the court who wrote the confusing decision, failed to apply the primary injury test, and their conclusion directly contradicts our holding in notes, which is the prior law. And then she sort of goes through the analysis and sets forth this very nice explanation of how the law worked up until this case. And the majority actually responds to her dissent in a footnote, and they say, hogwash, we didn't mean that, we mean this, and no worries. They actually use the word hogwash, which makes it interesting. So while I am pursuing the accompanying malpractice claim, still thinking, well, this case can't really mean this. Another case comes out. It is the Park Bank case. It is authored by Justice Bradley, and she is basically saying, as the majority now, as the side saying that has the winning side for the court saying, you know what, we didn't actually mean to say that in Cryer. Note still applies, and basically her dissent becomes the new majority opinion. The law is clarified. Clearly her prior dissent in Cryer was important in laying that out for the other justices who basically agreed with that later and said, oh, wait a minute, we didn't actually mean to have it have that global impact. We just wanted to say this one thing in this case. So I thought that this was sort of a good example, and I hope I've been able to explain it in a condensed way that makes sense as to why a dissent is important and how it can help clarify things, and how you want justices who will follow the law, and you want justices who will follow what we call precedent, which is prior case law, like the case I was talking about, because that makes the law clear. And if you have, in this case, it's corporate law. So if you have corporate law that's clear, people aren't going to be afraid to invest in Wisconsin businesses. Shareholders are going to know that this rule is going to be applied and it's going to make sense. And so that's one reason why it's just very important that you don't have a justice who comes into something with an outcome-oriented view. They should not be going into a case saying, well, I believe that this should be the answer, so let's find a way. I think just in my defense, since I liked her decision, I kind of wanted to illustrate with another case very briefly. A Supreme Court decision which, ideologically I didn't agree with at all, which was the McCabe v. Van Hollen decision. Ideologically, I thought it was the wrong decision. This was a challenge to the marriage amendment in 2010. This was a challenge that failed. I strongly favor equal rights for marriage, and so I was very much hoping that the amendment would get tossed out. Unfortunately, it was not the best challenge to the amendment. It was not an equal protection challenge. It was a challenge that was brought based on a procedural issue. And the court unanimously decided that the challenge was invalid and that the amendment had to be upheld. Justice Bradley was also on this court. I don't know what her ideological leanings are, but it suggests to me that she doesn't follow one way or another, that she applies the law, that she interprets Wisconsin law correctly, and that she doesn't let her beliefs influence that. And I bring that up kind of in the context of these are both civil things. You can think of lots of other aspects of civil court which might affect every individual. Everybody here in this room probably probably, hopefully, is insurance. We're all supposed to have it to drive. I looked at the docket, and there are at least 2 cases before the Supreme Court right now, maybe 3, I can't remember, interpreting when an insurance company needs to defend its insured, interpreting the scope of coverage. And, these aren't things that necessarily you find out because you're involved in a lawsuit. You find out because an insurance company says, oh, we don't need to protect you here anymore, or we don't need to provide you coverage here anymore. So these things affect, in some ways, every aspect of our lives. And, as employees, I think we could find a number of other examples. So that is, those are a couple examples. And then I guess I've been focusing on this independence and nonpartisanship as being important when I talk about why a justice shouldn't have ideological beliefs going into a case, why they need to be open-minded about law. Well, judiciary is a check on the other branches of government. And the one candidate, Judge Daley, is saying, he appreciates his support from the Republicans because they appreciate his respect for the rule of law. And he's running an ad right now saying that, plans to stop the common sense changes Governor Walker is making are being made, and Justice Bradley will block these reforms. He's taking a very, very strong partisan position, and he's taking that position without even knowing what the case before him is, without knowing what the facts are and the law of the case. He's saying, if it challenges this law, I already have an opinion about it. That, to me, leads to confusion, which leads to bad things, at a minimum. So I'll kind of stop there.
Well, hey, that is no coincidence, given the way Supreme Court politics has changed now to run competitively for that office. You do curry favor with partisans, and the partisan nature of campaign financing is unmistakable. You look at the donations. One side is donating to one candidate, another side is donating to the other candidate. And that does put these candidates in a position of then having to say things like that to signal their potential supporters that they'll be the kind of judge that those partisans want. That's very dangerous terrain for us to find ourselves on here in Wisconsin, and it's not unique to Wisconsin. We're seeing the partisanizing and politicizing of courts all across the country. So this is not unique to our state. But I think the bottom line is that the way my observation has been that these wealthy moneyed interests started by deciding that they wanted to take over the lawmaking branch of government, and they poured huge amounts of money into legislative campaigns, and then they decided they wanted to control the executive branch of government, and they threw huge amounts of money into elections for governor. And I think once they figured they had those branches pretty much sewn up, then they decided let's take over the judicial branch too, and let's neuter that check on the legislative and executive branches of government. And I think they have been far too successful in that aim for the good of our state. That's a huge problem, and it's one that we all need to come to terms with. Do you want to throw it open for questions and turn this into a conversation? I've certainly said my piece. I am going to say some things about what we might do to get out of this.
Wondering how many other states elect the Supreme Court judges? I had never heard of this before we became Wisconsinites.
Oh, okay. Where are you from?
Kansas.
Kansas, okay. To be honest, I don't know. You know?
I don't have the figures in front of me. A minority of states elect judges.
Supreme Court judges?
Correct. But Wisconsin's far from the only one. There are Supreme Court elections in many states, but not most states. The last I looked at the numbers, I think we're talking like 14 or 15 or 16 states that hold elections. And of course, we've had a long tradition of electing judges all the way down to the circuit court level. We have had a lot of judicial elections in our state, all the way up to state Supreme Court. We've been doing it for over a century and a half. Now states follow that model, but we're certainly not alone in having so.
What happened in the year 2007, Jacob?
Well, we really saw the influx of money in Wisconsin politics in earnest, starting in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. And the focus was seeking to influence legislative races and races for governor. This is a state that used to elect somebody to the U.S. Senate. He didn't lose an election for 30 years, and he never spent $300 on one of his statewide campaigns. He ran successfully for statewide office. His last election, he spent $145.10. That was possible in Wisconsin. His last election was in the mid-1980s, and he spent $145. We've now had elections for governor where overall spending has been $80 million, in excess of $80 million. We've seen state Supreme Court races that used to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars when they were really expensive, now reach $6 million. But we first saw the money going into legislative races and races for governor, and I think once the moneyed interests figured out that they could really control, have a tremendous amount of influence over lawmaking and administration through the executive branch, they figured, why not turn our sights to the judicial branch?
So there wasn't any legislation?
No, there was no change in the law that precipitated it. I think one of the big things that happened to politics was TV. There was a time when newspapers were king in American politics, and getting your name in the newspaper was the best way to reach people. And television rose to prominence. America is the only major democracy on earth without some system of free airtime for candidates seeking office. We make candidates pay for the airtime to communicate with voters. That's why we have $80 million elections for governor or $7 million elections for Supreme Court.
Can I add something to that too? Just with respect to 2007 in particular, I think too that the moneyed interests saw the opportunity to tip the balance of the court. At that point, the court was more balanced, and Judge Wilcox was retiring, and so you had two candidates, neither of whom was an incumbent. And in Wisconsin, prior to Justice Butler's laws, I think one incumbent had lost, and I believe that he was somehow blamed for the Milwaukee Braves leaving the state. So I'm not going to show the details of that. So this was the race to sort of say, okay, we can get this seat. Essentially, we can buy this seat, which is what the moneyed interests essentially did. And then they had success with that. And so then when Justice Butler was up for election, they took it one step further and they said, let's put this money in and let's try and knock off an incumbent here. And so that was done. So I think 2007 was also seen as a turning point in terms of the balance of the court between justices who were viewed as being progressive, justices who were viewed as being conservative. And that's not necessarily accurate. I think that many of the longer serving justices actually aren't that predictable, which is good. And they now have sort of newer candidates who seem to be aligning themselves with one philosophy.
See, I think you'll see more predictability.
Yes.
Because of the way elections have changed. You take somebody like Patrick Crooks, when he first joined the Supreme Court, he was seen as a conservative. He was seen as a quote unquote Republican, if you wanted to put a partisan label on a justice. Justice Crooks is now widely viewed as part of the 3-member liberal minority. So, you know, Justice Crooks, I think, was a great example of what we used to have on the Supreme Court, which was people who were not cut out of a specific ideological or political mold, and they could be much more unpredictable. So what people thought he wasn't necessarily what he turned out to be. I think the way our elections have changed, I think you're going to see people decide early on and send very clear cues of how they will behave as justices, and you'll see a lot more predictability, and I think that's a loss. I think that's to the detriment of our court.
I agree that it's to the detriment. I think 2007 in particular was the Supreme Court for those reasons.
Yep.
Yes.
Can you speak to the constitutional amendment, aka the revenge amendment?
Sure. I thought that it might come up. So right now, the Chief Justice is the Chief Justice because she is the most senior member of the court. That makes sense for a lot of reasons. The amendment is going to change that so that the majority of the justices would elect the chief, and I believe the chief would be, I have the amendment here, but I believe it would be every 2 years. The chief would be reelected, which to me seems like a pretty big administrative hassle when a lot of what the Chief Justice does is administrative. And it doesn't also seem like a very good idea to have the majority on the court also appointing the chief, because I think, again, you cut down on any possibility for balance. If you have some seniority from someone who is, technically in the minority, they're going to maybe be able to check things a little bit in terms of how they administer the court. They can keep some sort of balance there. So I think it's an attempt to do away with that as well. I don't see any logistical reason for it other than the legislature is displeased with the current Chief Justice. Yes.
Doesn't the chief also have the power of signing the author of the decision once they've accepted it and kind of decided to take a vote on it? So that would be a loss.
Yes.
In addition to the
If we can't trust the ethical nature of the justices to see plainly that the majority selecting the Chief Justice is in and of itself a bias, can we trust them to make competent decisions in the interest of fairness for the well-being of the state?
Well, we have to be able to trust them. It's critically important that we trust them. It's critically important that we have trust in our court system. And I think that's what Mike is saying, is that if elections are occurring in a fashion that undermine our trust, that's problematic. I don't view the current justices on the court as being untrustworthy with respect to the issue of the Chief Justice's election. I do know that candidate Daley has said that he looks forward to electing Chief Justice, so he has made his position on that.
Just follow up on that. It seems this is very dismaying, very discouraging in a way, but it sounds like what you're saying is true. There's a pervasive corruption of the system, and this is you get people in who are corrupt. And it seems like what you're saying is that it comes from our people running for office, including even the judges, pandering, to people to get elected, which makes they're inherently corrupt. And that's just awful. how could you trust someone who gets in who's corrupted that way? I don't know, that's like, kind of blows your mind when you think about that. And you think about how that can go all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States and all through the system. I mean, I guess already happening that way, but my goodness, where is this going to end?
The Supreme Court is appointed, which is interesting because it's a different system. And it's a lifetime appointment. And so there is some, and I don't know if you feel it's Supreme Court, but there is some, there is a counterpoint to electing justices, which is if they are appointed, then they have some independence. They're not beholden necessarily, they have time to evolve and change over their careers. Is 10 years enough? Is a 10-year term enough for a justice to evolve and develop some independence from the interests that may have supported his or her campaign? I don't know. I'm not willing to give up faith in the court system because I practice in it every day. But I want people to be more involved in electing judges and paying attention to what's going on with decisions coming out of the court. But I think that's what's really important, is the way that you counteract a sense of hopelessness or injustice is to get involved in elections and get other people involved and get people out to vote. And I think that's what's really critically important. That's what everyone can do.
I guess my take on this as a non-lawyer, as a citizen, is that whether or not lawyers have lost faith in the system has no impact whatsoever on how the public feels about our courts and our court system. Unless you know a lot of lawyers and talk with them frequently, your trust in the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the court system as a whole, your faith in the integrity of that system is based on your own perceptions, what you're hearing, what you're seeing, what you know them to be doing. And people watch this, and I think for the public, there is no question that there has been a loss of trust in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. There's been a loss of faith. The public's faith has been shaken in the integrity of our Supreme Court. Now, the interesting thing is that we elect a Supreme Court, but we've been electing a Supreme Court for over 150 years. And we used to have a court that was held in extremely high regard. And today our faith has been shaken in the integrity of the court. You can appoint judges instead, but look no further than the U.S. Supreme Court. People have lost faith and their trust has been shaken in the U.S. Supreme Court, which is an appointed court. I think the solution there isn't any magical solution, appointment or election. We have to fix our political process. We have to select people who have more of a sense of the common good and who are able to deal with each other across party lines and who are able to compromise and cooperate. We at the current moment are in a very poisonous political environment. And that political environment, that landscape, then ends up affecting the courts and the entire judicial system. And, so I don't think elections are the problem. Elections served us very well in Wisconsin for a very long time. The fact that they've been turned into auctions and they're being conducted in this hyper-partisan, very poisonous kind of political environment, that's the problem. And we have to look at the problems plaguing the courts holistically. We have to look at how the entire political culture is affecting the courts. And, if you think that appointment is the way out, I guess what I would say is, shouldn't a judge be something more than a lawyer who happens to know a governor really well? Or a president? And you look at recent Supreme Court appointments, the U.S. Supreme Court. It appears to me, and I'm a non-lawyer, but I'm an avid Supreme Court watcher nevertheless. It appears to me that one of the major criteria that is used is they look for somebody who's young, who will be on the U.S. Supreme Court for a long time so that they can have their ideology, that president, that administration can have their ideology reflected on the court for decades. So they're not looking for the most qualified, most respected jurists in America. They're looking for somebody who's 50 years old. So that their imprint on the Supreme Court will be lasting. That's an appointed system. And that has left the public's faith shaken. I think all of this is a symptom of a much bigger problem, and that's the political culture that we've allowed to grow up around us. We need to fix that political culture if we're going to get the courts out of this trap.
Well, it would seem to be then that what would follow from that is that the voter has to really deal with nuance and or be well educated. I mean, it sounds like you're saying you have to make kind of a character judgment, like was this person ethical, or is he just pandering?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I mean, that's a pretty nuanced thing for most people to really.
But our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents appeared to have been better able to select public officials who would appoint for less crassly ideological or political reasons, or when they had elections, they elected people to the Wisconsin Supreme Court who didn't behave the way today's justices behave. So there's something that's changed about our whole political culture, and we have, as voters, our generation, current voters haven't done as good a job as past generations in putting the right kinds of people in office.
And I just wanted to say something, though, with respect to what you said in terms of actually choosing a justice, because it is different in that it's nonpartisan, and so you're not going to have one person or the other saying, I believe in this, and I believe in this. You don't want that. You want someone who says this is how I will apply the law. And I think if you look at the candidates, you are asking people to make what seems like an abstract decision, but sometimes it's easy. Look at the person who says, I appreciate the independence of the judiciary, or the judiciary should be nonpartisan, or I'm not going to take a stand on that because that's not my job. My job is to apply the facts of the case to the question of law before me, and that's it. In this race, it's really clear. One candidate is saying that, one's not. But that was sort of what I was trying to say before with respect to independence. That's what you want in a judicial candidate, and I think you can look at resumes and you can say who has the better experience or background to deal with the questions on the court. So it's hard. Granted, it's different from what we're used to, but there are sort of ways to navigate that and look for someone who has that integrity. Yes.
Call me a jaundiced person or a skeptic, but I think that some people might say that before the election and would vote in a contrary manner after the election. I think that the most critical thing that we have to do is to publicly finance these elections. Get private, personal, wealthy money out of buying the loudest, most frequent, and longest advertisements that bombard the public, that shower them with, just as advertising will. Coca-Cola didn't sell and become the greatest soft drink company in the world because it stayed in obscurity. It became that because it advertised more heavily than any other soft drink company. It's the same with these elections. We've got to not appoint judges. We've got not to allow free money to buy the elections. We've got to get a reasonable system of publicly financed Supreme Court.
Sure, but then you're dealing with Citizens United, which is a Supreme Court case that's allowing all of the money to come in. And that's, I mean, that's the United States Supreme Court that's had this one decision has had this huge influence on, our whole system.
But would that apply to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court?
Citizens United
Yes.
certainly does
Yes.
affect our state elections.
Yes.
Since the Citizens United decision, we've seen election spending in Wisconsin more than triple.
But could Wisconsin pass a law
We
that
already did.
overrode that?
No,
It could.
no, but we already passed a law that created public financing for Supreme Court elections. It's something that the Democracy Campaign worked on for years, and we finally won in 2009. And we got something called the Impartial Justice Act enacted. It was our belief that we need to turn these auctions back into elections. The law was allowed to function at half strength for one election. They legally challenged a key component of the law and tied it up in court. So one very key part of the law wasn't in effect. The basic public financing to candidates was in effect for one election. It was a significantly less expensive election, turns out, than the auctions that we saw in 2007 and 2008. But the law was never allowed to function as it was designed to function, and then it was repealed. When Governor Walker was elected, one of the very first things he did in his very first state budget was to repeal the Impartial Justice Act, and the legislature went along with that. So, to me, what that signals right there is that they saw that as a threat to their ability to continue to claim ownership of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. They saw that law. Some people said, oh, it'll never work. They obviously thought it would, because they wasted no time in getting rid of it. And so
What was their justification for doing that?
they didn't really say anything. They just repealed it, and they did it, and they repealed it in the state budget, so it was lost in thousands of other provisions, and they never really said anything. Now, generally, what they say about public financing is that it's, that's welfare for politicians, or that's socialized campaigning, and public money shouldn't be used to pay for candidates' ads, and those are the general arguments that they throw out there, but they really didn't say anything. It was just sort of quietly repealed.
And, I'm not going to dispute any of the problems that, I'm just in complete agreement with respect to the problems that money brings to elections. But it is the system that we're working in right now. And so, what I kind of hope, too, is that we don't feel hopeless, and that we don't feel like there's nothing that we can do. And I guess the tactic that you take in terms of this is how it is right now, this is what we're dealing with right now, is well, what do we do right now then? And that's what I'm more interested in is not that I'm less interested in, all of the good work that Democracy Campaign has done and it's doing. It's just I'm curious as to how to engage people with the Supreme Court races, because turnout in every election is really important, and the lowest turnout is in the spring election, and the lowest turnout is in the Supreme Court election. So that's something that I think is very, very important. It's just simply getting people to care and getting them.
Well, I left the Democracy Campaign because I was not convinced that if I spent another 15 years doing that work, that it would be game-changing enough. I think we have to push as citizens to change the political parties and to compel the political parties to reconnect meaningfully with the people, and thereby change the political culture in our state. That will in turn create conditions that can help bring our courts back from the brink. But without that change, without fundamentally working to change the political culture, you're going to continue to have governors and legislators who are intent in making sure that the Supreme Court is under their thumb. And they will go to great lengths to accomplish that. Of course, all they're doing is the bidding of their own wealthy benefactors, their own donors, and they're the ones who really want this control. You know, there was this case out of West Virginia where the West Virginia Supreme Court, a lower court awarded a coal company a huge amount of money because of another major coal company's unfair business practice. And the CEO of the larger coal company, the one that had engaged in the unfair business practice and who was facing a huge penalty for it, went out and put $3 million into the election for state Supreme Court, got a judge named Brent Benjamin elected to the West Virginia Supreme Court, and Brent Benjamin then cast the deciding vote overturning the jury award. There was this direct payback for that election. Well, we've got a really similar case right here, the Menasha Corporation tax case, where you had, again, a ruling that required the company to pay significant taxes for computer software, and a party to that case was Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. Well, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce put several $1 million behind the election of Annette Ziegler, who later cast the deciding vote, overturning that lower court decision and getting the company off the hook for a huge amount of tax liability.
This brings up...
That's the kind of thing that will erode public confidence.
This brings up another important thing that you should look at when you're looking at who you want to elect as your Supreme Court justice, is what is their position on recusing themselves? They can publicly take a position on that. It's not a political position. So that's not a partisan position. So they should answer that question. You know, do you feel if you receive contributions from this organization, or if you work in this organization, should you recuse yourself from hearing those cases? The answer to that's very important. So that's, you know, thanks for raising that. I hadn't thought to bring that up in terms of what we can look at for integrity, and that's
and the interesting thing is that West Virginia case became the inspiration for John Grisham to write the novel The Appeal, but it also ended up in a United States Supreme Court case, Caperton versus Massey, where the United States Supreme Court said that justice ruling on that case violated the due process rights of the other side in that case. The U.S. Supreme Court said that action in West Virginia was unconstitutional. It was a violation of due process. Well, Annette Ziegler got, if $3 million to Brent Benjamin amounted to a violation of due process, did $2 million from a party in a case to Annette Ziegler's election? Is that not a violation of due process? Did she participate in the case and ended up casting the deciding vote? There's where that justice, to my way of thinking, was duty-bound to recuse in that case. She was asked to decide a case involving an organization that had just spent $2 million to put her on the Supreme Court. She had a duty to recuse. She didn't even address whether she should or shouldn't accuse. She just went ahead and ruled on the case. So that's a wonderful point that people should be asking. If you've got somebody who's just spent a couple $1 million on your campaign, or if you've received a bunch of large campaign contributions from a party in a case, will you recuse yourself? Will you disqualify yourself from deciding that case? And we're increasingly seeing judges elected to these offices and going right on ahead and ruling on cases where they are horribly conflicted. They've got mammoth conflicts of interest. That's part of what's going haywire with our court system.
So being totally naive, what's the odds of getting two reputable judges running against each other just to say, we're not political, we're not going to take your money and run the old way. Is that, are we too far gone even? I know I may be totally.
I would, in this, and, Mike and I might disagree on this, which is okay. I would say in this era, I'm not going to judge any candidate for taking money because otherwise you will just lose. Why run?
But if both of them did it. But you never
They're
do that.
weird. I don't think
I'm being totally naive.
I don't think you're going to find that situation. I think that would be awesome. I think that would be great. But, yeah, I mean, I think it's always one is going to do it, so the other
It
is.
seems so clear.
And it's how it works.
And it's not naive at all to then, nor unreasonable for citizens to look at this situation and say, well, we can't trust these people then. Because the perception will be that they've been bought. They've been put on the court by interests that will then expect favorable rulings. That is cancerous when it comes to our justice system. And that's why I would argue what really needs to change is the broader political culture. We need to compel change within the political parties, because to pretend that somehow our nonpartisan courts remain authentically nonpartisan, that is naive. Because partisans have become so hyper-interested in influencing the court system, in influencing the judiciary, that it's become nonpartisan in name only. And we need to address that poisonous partisanship, and we need to compel parties to change their ways and reconnect with the people in a meaningful way. We do have two parties right now that are failing us. Both parties are failing us. And it's our job as citizens to compel at least one of them to change its ways, if not both.
While we're talking about depressing things, could you give us a little more background on the failure of the Judicial Commission to be able to police unethical behavior on the part of Supreme Court justices? And where, I think, isn't the budget bill talking about reconstituting it to make it even weaker?
Well, when I was at the Democracy Campaign, we filed the complaint with the Judicial Commission that led to the investigation of Annette Ziegler, because she had a pattern of back when she was a circuit court judge, and she became the first Supreme Court justice ever found guilty of judicial misconduct. But then when it came time for punishment, she was given simply a formal reprimand. And then later, it wasn't the Democracy Campaign, but there was a complaint filed seeking to trigger another Judicial Commission investigation of Michael Gableman, and the commission was not willing or able to go forward. What all of that ends up signaling is that we don't have a judicial watchdog that is either willing or able to police the kind of behavior on the court. And the passage that I read from my book, that behavior, of course, was in reference to Justice Prosser, and that has not led to any discipline or any sort of misconduct action. And again, and so all of that, I think, contributes to a further erosion of public confidence and public trust, which I think leads the Supreme Court to a very dangerous place. To me, the judiciary is totally dependent on public confidence and public trust. And if it loses that, it loses its most valuable asset. And that is what is being lost here. And I don't think there's sufficient appreciation for that on the court or within the political process. I think what's being done to our court is criminal. And to me, what happened, I don't think this needs to depress us, because we do need to remember that these kinds of conditions have existed before. Past generations encountered these very kinds of cancers growing in the body of democracy. And on multiple occasions, they rose to the occasion and produced waves of reform that got us to a better place. And you all, there's a little bit of gray in the audience here, so you all remember a time when Wisconsin was known from coast to coast as a bastion, a beacon of clean and open and honest government. That was our inheritance. And we've largely allowed that inheritance to be trashed. But what that suggests is that past generations were able to deal with the onset of corruption in past times, produce waves of reform that ended up giving us that inheritance. And if they could do it, I just refuse to believe that there's something different about us or wrong with us today that makes us less capable of making political change than past generations were. So to me, I believe that pendulums swing. And I believe that forces of corruption are always looking for opportunities to corrupt. And then when conditions grow serious enough, citizens respond. And I have great faith that that will happen again. I subtitled the book, The Coming Makeover of American Politics, for a reason. It's not only an expression of optimism, that's actually my prediction. I believe a new era of political reform is coming. I don't have a good enough crystal ball to know how quickly it's going to come, but the pendulum has been pushed very, very far and very high, and pendulums swing. And so when it's been pushed so high, it will swing back with vengeance.
I've been trying to notice who's had their hands raised, and if I haven't gotten to it, I know that I missed you last time.
Gerrymandering, voter suppression, money in politics, all stand alone as really serious problems. But I also look at them in a bigger picture as tools, deliberate tools, and to go into the executive branch and then in the legislature, and now finally in the judicial branch, which was our last hope, because lobbyists can write laws and give them to the legislature and be promoting them through the executive branch. But when people finally are upset with a law, they turn to the judicial branch for recourse. And now, with this kind of thing, through those tools, money, voter suppression, we're at the point where we're pretty much fed up. And I think the real issue here is that these are all stepping stones to a final problem that I see, and that problem is that I think the bigger goal for, if you want to call them the 1% or the people that are in power, is to disenfranchise voters. Because when they do anything, just like when they took broadband away, we used to have free TV, everybody took it for granted, all of a sudden it's gone. Oh, you'll love the new system, cheap, no more commercials. Now what do we have? You give it away within one generation. You go talk to somebody on the street that's 20 and say, oh, we used to own that, it was all free, and they'll be like, why did you give it away? And it's the same way with voting. They've disenfranchised us, and within 2 generations, you'll be like, my parents didn't vote, I don't vote, you can take it away now because I can't miss something I never had.
Well, you raise an interesting point, which I think we've been talking about a little bit, which is, how important voting is, and how important turnout is. And the sad thing about the spring election, the thing that just kills me, is that people don't vote in the spring election. So it's not like where, sometimes I think there are obvious attempts to keep voters away from the polls when they think that it's going to be a big turnout, a big election, because the big turnout quickly helps Democrats. But the Republicans are the ones who seem to be enacting all of the laws that are suppressing the vote. But with respect to the judicial election, it's not about the suppression of the vote, it's about people not coming out to vote.
It's a cultural change.
Maybe it is a cultural change, and that was one of the things that I was sort of interested in talking about, was how do we communicate better to citizens who aren't attorneys, this affects you on a day-to-day basis, even if you're not a criminal, even if you're not, litigious, it just affects how the world is structured, essentially, and your life as an employee or a consumer or anything else. And I think that to me is more of what I would like to be trying to do because I don't want to say I've given up hope, but I'm not real optimistic in the short term that we're going to change money politics or that we're going to change every law that comes down the pathway. But how do we change the cultural engagement with our Supreme Court and with our judiciary? And how do we view it as something important and critical and something that everyone needs to keep up with and take part in?
I think we've already been trained not to. When I was young, I remember watching my grandparents get dressed up to go vote. And my grandma put her little flag pin on her coat before she left the house. And now you can go to a university and you can ask a bunch of kids, who's the vice president of the United States? These are kids that are in college.
I've seen these videos.
Yeah, and it's like they haven't got a clue. But then you say, well, who's Brad Pitt's wife? And they're so proud. They know all that stuff.
Sure.
But they haven't got a clue about their government or...
And that's an important cultural, issue.
One thing I would say is that I actually have a chapter in my book called Millennials to the Rescue. I actually think that the generation that you're talking about will end up being our salvation.
I sure hope so.
They will come of age. And there's a lot of reasons that I go into as to why I think that is. But all the things that you mentioned, voter suppression, gerrymandering, court packing, all of these things, it is not a coincidence that they're all happening at the same time. The Republican Party, one of the things I say in the book is we've got two parties that are failing us. We've got one party that is scary and another that is scared. The interesting thing about that line is I've yet to have a single person in a single audience ask me which one's which. The reason I call the Republican Party a scary party is because that party was the party of Lincoln. It was the party of Teddy Roosevelt. It was the party of Eisenhower. It was a party dedicated to creating opportunity for all. It is now a party dedicated to serving the rich. That party, however, is staring down the barrel of a demographic shotgun. And that's why they're doing all these things. They understand that they are staring down the barrel of a demographic shotgun. They can see how the country's demographics are changing, and they see themselves at great risk. They feel very vulnerable. So they are trying to rig elections. They are trying to rig courts. They are trying to do everything they can to be able to advance their agenda and hold on to power, even though they are acting on borrowed time. And I think what we all have, the reason we can be optimistic is that gerrymandering is not new. It's as old as democracy itself. Court packing. Exactly. Court packing and voter suppression. What we may be feeling today, an awful lot of, women didn't have the vote for a very long time, and African Americans didn't have the vote. And, these tactics are not new. They're as old as the Republic. They're older than the Republic. They're being used now for a reason. And they are symptomatic of the fact that there is great vulnerability on the part of the party that is doing all these things. That suggests to me that we are approaching a moment where all hell is going to break loose.
Well, I have a 21-year-old daughter, and I begged her to vote. I begged her. And I said, Grace, please. And she's like rolling her eyes at me. I said, let me ask you one question. I said, if they reinstated the draft, and it was girls too, and you had to go, she's like, my girlfriends aren't going to no more. There's more of us than there are of you. And I said, all I'm saying is, if you don't vote now, by the time they decide to do that and send you, it will change the landscape so dramatically with the laws and everything. You will no longer have a choice.
Well, that brings up an interesting point, which, oh, I'm sorry. Which I think, you know, especially with respect to the Supreme Court election, if you're talking to people about this election, and if people want to know who you're voting for and why, or why it's important to vote, more than just for the sake of voting and civic participation, if you could. It's, you know, it is helpful to be able to talk to people about how the decisions of the court affect them personally, because I think that makes a difference. And if you know, I don't know if anything that we've said today kind of helps enable people to do that or not. I'm kind of curious about how you feel about that. So,
Well, who are the good people that are out there? I mean,
Well-
who are the candidates that we should be voting for?
I think that I think we were going to try and sort of stay away from endorsing candidates, but I kind of feel like my remarks may have, you know, given you an indication why, you know, would say those that, you know, yes.
As far as the constitutional amendment, which
Yeah.
is on the ballot this year,
Yeah.
what was the groundswell of reasoning to change this? I mean, besides, is there any other reason to change this than just as a kind of a backhanded way of changing the dynamics?
No, I mean, I'm not aware of any.
So, what was the reason given by the legislature and the governor why to put this out?
I have whatever the legislative reference bureau put out on this. Was there a public reason put out that was?
Whatever lame rationalization has been offered
Yeah.
doesn't mask the true intent.
I'm not
This was
sure
initiated by the legislature because they would like to have more control over the court than they already have.
Yeah.
And they're confident that if this constitutional amendment passes, that somebody of their ideological persuasion will become Chief Justice. It is crassly political, and that's patently obvious. And it's why they have done all of these things. It's why they've pursued voter suppression policies, why they engaged in such naked partisan gerrymandering of legislative districts. It's why they are doing all of these things, is to try to consolidate power as best they can. And you know, Republicans a generation ago would not have, they didn't do these kinds of things, they didn't resort to these kinds of tactics, they never would have thought of resorting to these kinds of tactics. All of that suggests to me that Republicans are feeling vulnerable. Their ability to have a governing majority is at risk, and they feel that they need to go to these lengths.
Background that was offered, I guess, which is currently 19 states allow their Supreme Court or court of last resort to elect the Chief Justice. 8, including Wisconsin, select the Chief Justice by seniority. So they're basically saying, you know, what we would be doing would be on par with what other states are doing. They don't really, I mean, there's no real justification for it other than this is how it's sometimes done, and it's okay that we do it, and that the system with respect to our Supreme Court has changed just administratively so that it would make sense. I mean, it's not, there's no real explanation given for the reason, so, yes.
Is there any way for citizens to know how attorneys and lawyers feel about the candidates that are coming into the Supreme Court? After all, that would be, since they're interested in partiality, being partial to the situation, they should be able to generate some information to the public to say, this would be a preferred direction to go if we're looking at, in general, at public interest.
Well,
cases that come before.
and I think that's what I've been trying to give you without taking a partisan position, is to say what's preferred is a justice who isn't partisan, who is talking about independence and applying the facts of the case of the law. And I know that sounds really vague.
Well, you're one individual. What is
Yeah.
Well, the state-
American Law
the
Association,
state-
Wisconsin Law Association, and so on. Think about these things. Where does one get that information from? What is a group as a whole thing?
The State Bar Association does poll its members and ask if they feel a candidate for judicial office is highly qualified, qualified, not very qualified. And people can look to the state bar.
I haven't seen that information.
Or sometimes candidates will be publicly endorsed. You can, sometimes look to see who has endorsed them.
You can check out the State Bar Association's website. I think they do offer that. I think they do
I don't
offer
think
that
they've taken that poll yet
for this race.
for this race.
Are they going to?
They've done it Dane County wide in the past, and I know there's
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, so.
and the debate's coming up shortly from the Dane County Bar Association.
We have two other attorneys in the audience, so I feel like maybe now would be a good time to open it up and say, how do you think people can, find out what attorneys think about the candidates in the day's court? And is that even important? I don't know.
Speaking personally, would rather have my opinion just judge as a citizen, not as a person with special expertise, but I have to say I completely agree with and hope that our community is able to see its way past all the hyper and all the money and all the TV advertising to try to elect people with integrity, care more about the institution's integrity and their own integrity. And I'd be happy to give opinions to who I think displays that more prominently in a given election. I think you start with that set of criteria, and that's really my only hope in this climate, is that we have enough people voted on the inside who would end up being in the pool from whom justices would be elected to carry that quality forward and save the court from turning into a pile of junk.
Well, I agree with just about everything he said. It seems to me that one of the best things I could say to people as an attorney is don't pay attention to the ads on television at all. Don't get your political information, your information about any election from television, no matter what the content of the ads happens to be. If people could simply take that step and look to other sources of information and then spend, I would say, 5 to 10% of the time that they spend studying the Badgers and the Packers.
1% will do.
Right. If they did those things, none of this would be happening. And I strongly believe that.
I have an idea kind of just based on what we were talking about with the State Bar Survey. There is a lot of good information available online now publicly about the Supreme Court decisions, about which justices, authored the decision. So for instance, if you feel really passionately about something, like if you felt really passionately about Act 10, that decision is available online. And it, will tell you, which justices were in the majority in that decision, which justices were in the minority. It might help you in a future election to decide, maybe I didn't like where they stood at all on these issues, and I'm an issue voter. As much as I don't think you should vote on issues, if that's how you do it, that's how you want to do it. With the Supreme Court, I don't think you should vote on a partisan fashion. But if you want to look at how they view equal protection, or these different things, would it be helpful to just provide the group with sort of a links to this available decisions or anything like that? Would people look at that? Would they be interested in that? I don't know.
I think I would really echo what you just said. People should make no judgment based on advertising. And actually, here's a hopeful note. One of the things that is clearly happening in the political industry is, and it's one of the things that is driving the campaign arms race, is that they are running ads much more frequently. They have to run a much greater volume of advertising because the public is getting increasingly skillful at avoiding political ads. With DVRs and just with stomachs turning, people are escaping political advertising, and what the political industry is doing in response is simply increasing the volume of advertising and also increasing the volume of the message. They're getting incredibly shrill but actually that's a hopeful sign, because what it suggests is the era of political advertising as the dominant force in election campaigns is beginning to draw to a close. And I think what we all need to think about is how we can use other media, whether it's social media or any other tool. How can we help usher out that era of television advertising playing such a dominant role? That would improve judicial elections immeasurably. The other hopeful chord I can strike is that keep in mind that Wisconsin outlawed bribery in 1897. Y'all know when Wisconsin became a state, I hope. 1848. That means that bribing public officials was perfectly legal in the state for the first half century of statehood. And according to the history books, the practice was very common. Bags of cash were openly exchanged at the state capitol. And eventually that practice was outlawed in 1897. What has happened to us but a new form of legal bribery has grown up around us. And Citizens United will eventually find its way into the trash bin of history. It is inevitable. It will not be the law of the land forever, because eventually the disgust will rise to a level that it rose in the late 19th century, and people said, enough of this. No more bribing public officials. And we'll eventually see, one way or another, whether it's by constitutional amendment or by some future Supreme Court
Revolution.
rethinking, but what will really drive it is citizen activism. And that's what we need to focus on, is doing our part as citizens in agitating and advocating for a change in our political culture, pushing back against the way that our democracy is being contaminated.
Stephen had asked a question.
I guess if I was actually going to look at change, I would say that the legal profession needs to put together a committee of particularly skilled and ethical lawyers who review judicial candidates and then is able to communicate their perceptions to a population that probably does not have a 10th grade reading level. What drives me crazy when people talk about millennials is that they tend to talk about white educated millennials. And the millennials I work with are not white educated millennials. And so you have to basically, I think, have those two processes. Otherwise, having moved here from Chicago because this was supposedly better and was for a very long period of time, you end up with Chicago. And in the 1980s, they had a process by which you voted yes or no on judges, and there would be 120 judges in the county. It reached the point where 1 year they went within 4% points of de-electing every judge in the county. The year, 2 years after that, when they had the next election, you had to flip no or yes. My daughter's first experiences in an election when she was 3 or 4 years old was voting no on judges, helping in their voting no. You don't want that culture to develop in the state, because then you're in real trouble. And that's pretty much where we're going. I mean, we We talk ideology, but this budget is loaded with corruption.
But just to play devil's advocate, do keep in mind that the progressive movement was the product of a citizenry where many, if not most people, did not have high school diplomas.
Right.
And many were illiterate. So people who were unlettered, people who were not highly educated, had the common sense to see poisonous political conditions and rose up against them.
But a lot of the people leading them spoke the same language.
Yes.
And increasingly, the language that's spoken by the educated class has increased. I mean, I worked in adult literacy for like 10 years. The language that they use in the educated class is quite often different than the language that's used by a lot of other people. And if you really notice, a lot of far-right political stuff, I mean, we basically had to dissect welfare reform in the 1990s. I took a guy who had no experience with spreadsheets, who totally deconstructed the budget and showed that it was loaded and wasn't designed to work in 3 days. And he was taught how to do the Excel spreadsheets the day before. They spent probably 70% of that budget on sound bites for the people who had very low comprehension and reading skills, so they could sell it. And that's the difference between, to a good degree, the approach that's done quite often by progressives and the approach done by the people who basically are looking at this as a path to control and then corruption and ruling. And we need to figure out how to do that. And the legal stuff is incredibly hard because it's stuff that a lot of us who are very well educated don't totally understand. But at the same point, the only people who probably can get to the core ethical issues and get this off of the scary lady voice are lawyers.
I agree with you. It's a really complicated, really tough issue in that respect. And, on the one hand, it does involve sort of these complicated issues, but on the other hand, I think you can convey to people, anyone, no matter what their background, no matter what their education, what integrity is, and what independence is. And I think those are really the key things, and I think you can probably convey to anyone what, the value of, say, just something as basic as like equal rights is, just some of the basic tenets of our Constitution that progressives believe in, and that we need to motivate young people, whether they're educated or minorities or anything, to care about and to see affecting their lives. So I sometimes think it's not as complicated as we make it. The system seems complicated, but looking for the right person might not be. And that might be a way to convey it to people. Yeah.
I would have this comment about, and somewhat to that point, about this particular election. I am shocked as an attorney that one of the candidates is taking a partisan position regarding what the incumbent governor is doing legislatively and in the legislature. And I think that the legal profession, my attorney colleagues and the judges out there in the Wisconsin legal community have been too timid in denouncing that. I'm shocked to hear that quote from one of the candidates. If that quote were coming from a candidate who suited my politics, who I agreed with politically, I would still say they weren't qualified to be a Supreme Court judge. And I think that all of the judges in Wisconsin and all of the attorneys ought to say the same thing about that candidate. If we don't have impartial judges, we can't check the executive branch. And let's face it, if we lose that impartiality in the judiciary, we lose the ability of our justice system to resolve disputes fairly, and if the perception that it can resolve disputes fairly is taken away, we end up with those decisions being made by a dictator, or a tyrant, or a king, or a trial by battle, or a trial by ordeal. Okay? That's kind of a rundown of the systems that have been tried previously.
But,
So colleagues in the bar they've lost sight of that, and they just kind of want to duck and cover, and they don't want to have this controversy, and they want to act like it's the way it was before, but no candidate for Supreme Court, or no judicial candidate would say that kind of thing 20 years ago. It just would not be done.
Maybe it's just a matter of saying, do you feel like if you ended up in court, would you get a fair shot? And it's as simple as if somebody has already made up their mind, if someone is already saying, I agree with the governor, and they don't know what the case is, do you feel like it would be fair if you were in court and you knew that the judge had already made up his or her mind? How would you feel about that? It might be as simple as that. So that would be, that would maybe just be one way of communicating.
Well, why can't the Wisconsin Bar Association police those type of things? And why can't they police people that don't recuse themselves and have conflict of interest? Because those people still hold a law license in the state. And isn't that the job of the Wisconsin Bar Association, or am I wrong?
It's actually, well, the legal field is a self-policing field, and that includes the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and the justices. Everyone is essentially held to task by members of their own profession. And so, yes, you have things like the Judicial Committee, you have things like that, but I think we talked earlier about how that's not been particularly effective. And it is unfortunate, and I don't know necessarily how to improve it. That's not really my area. That is definitely more Mike's area. So I don't know what you think about that.
I echo the earlier comment. I think the legal community has been ducking and covering. And they, I think, are pretending that the system is like it used to be, and it's not. And I think if there's anything that the legal community can do to help get us to a better place, it's to come fully to terms with how much the environment has changed, and very aggressively and boldly address those issues. So far, that has not been forthcoming, and I think that's a problem.
Well, if you had a group of like retired, esteemed judges who were bipartisan, who weren't going to be trying anything, who weren't going to, and if they could become like the elders that did some oversight, that would be, I think, one approach could be done. Because, a lawyer's going to be freaked out that if they speak out, the political appointee is going to go against them. And that's when you really start getting into the downslide, because you're all modifying your behavior to fit a corrupt system. I thought it was fascinating to see Sue Ann Thompson and Dale Schultz on the endorsement list.
For Judge Bradley.
For Judge Bradley. After the past 5 or 6 years, it was really refreshing to start seeing somebody who says, the judiciary needs to be something other than a rubber stamp or a politicized body.
That used to be very common.
Yeah.
It was very common to see a candidate for Supreme Court with a bipartisan list of endorsements, and it's become a relative rarity.
You used the word unfortunate, and to speak to what this gentleman was talking about, that to reach the kind of people that I live with, and you obviously have experience with, that's not a strong enough word. You just have to call bullshit. And I think that's where we're at. You want to know how to reach people. These people that are living a blue-collar life or uneducated, they may not have the wherewithal to articulate. And they realize that the people that do articulate gravitate towards the top of the party. But there's still a minority at the top of the party, and that's the one thing that Republicans are really, really good at. And I would have to say, you have to give them credit for realizing that it's not so much about the people involved, they just need a person like Scott Walker, who doesn't have the credentials, who didn't finish college, who they can relate to, stick a gun in his hands and a ball cap on his head, and give him a sound bite, and he screws it up once in a while, throws some money at it and fix it, and just keep him going, and have him deny things and avoid talking where he can. And it's in the same way in the judicial branch.
You know, I'd say the same thing about the millennials.
I agree.
It was earlier said that, that
They want to hear the truth.
the young people don't know who's on the Supreme Court, but, they can name anybody who's on American Idol, and they're not paying attention, they're not informed, and they're not this and they're not that. My own take, I get to talk on a lot of college campuses, I go to a lot of high school classrooms, I'm going to DeForest High School tomorrow. I find young people let me put it this way, they can read the handwriting on the wall. They are much more aware of how things are working than they are given credit for. And if they see a choice that is a couple of people who are operating in a corrupt fashion in a corrupt system, and they think choosing one of them isn't going to get us to a better place, the solution, the thing that would draw them in is if one of the parties would start offering something that would excite them. If one of the parties would offer them something that they could have faith in. Because they can read the handwriting on the wall. They understand what's going on in our society way better than we think they do. And once at least one party offers them something compelling, I think they will quickly engage, and I think it's an extremely bright generation, and I think they're very with it.
Well,
I do think that they will ultimately be our salvation.
Well, and I do think that we have to talk about things too, in terms of whether or not there is a perceived or real, like racial bias with respect to the judiciary that's seen. We haven't really talked about that, but Wisconsin has a very high incarceration rate. I think in particular, young African American men, whether or not they are getting the fair shake or think that they are not getting it, a fair chance in court. That's going to disillusion people, and it's going to disenfranchise people into the extent that there's this huge problem with the disproportionate number of felons who are minorities. There are bigger issues with respect to getting people to the Supreme Court than whether or not they can learn the issues. It's whether or not they feel like the court system in itself is inherently fair, whether they feel like the government is for them. So I don't know that we have time to necessarily talk about all that, but I think there's a whole other issue to be addressed here too. I think that people are perfectly capable of understanding what's going on. I don't think the issue is necessarily that people don't understand the judiciary. Sometimes I think it's that they have an understanding of it and they don't want to participate in the election because they feel like it's not their government. I'm not taking that position. I'm just saying that I think that he was out there and it's should be addressed too.
Thank you so much for coming. We're going to wrap it up now, and folks can ask personal questions afterwards. I've got just a couple things to say. We're going to have a little bit of a door prize here, which is very unusual for us, but something came up that we actually can give away. So, everybody got a ticket, by the way? Everybody got a ticket? Okay. Get a ticket here quick.
That's what you don't get.
All right.
Takes time.
There you go.
And the winner is.
And the winner is. Would you like to tell us?
We trust you.